The clerk at Bannister Hardware slid my check back across the counter like it might be contagious. "Sorry, sir. This one didn't go through. $47.20. A box of deck screws, a can of stain, and a new paintbrush." I'd been buying lumber and supplies from that same store for 22 years. The clerk, a kid named Dylan who'd been working there since high school, looked more embarrassed than I felt, which is saying something, because what I felt was a specific, cold kind of confusion that I imagine every person over a certain age eventually comes to know. "Try it again," I said. "There's plenty in that account." He tried it again. Same result. A woman behind me in line made a small, involuntary sound, the kind people make when they're trying very hard not to react to something that isn't their business. "It's fine," I told Dylan. "I'll come back." I left the paint and the screws on the counter and walked out into a cold October afternoon. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long minute, running the numbers in my head, because I am a man who has always run the numbers in his head first and asked questions second. There was no version of my finances where a $47 check should have bounced. I called my son from the parking lot. "If you're watching tonight, tell me in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I read every single one of them. And if a story about family, dignity, and the quiet cost of being underestimated speaks to you, go ahead and subscribe before we go further, because I promise you this one earns every minute of its runtime." My name is Frank Delacroix. I'm 69 years old, and for 34 years I flew commercial aircraft, first regional routes out of a small airfield in upstate New York, and eventually as a captain for a major airline, logging just under 22,000 flight hours before I retired at 60. My wife Carol passed 4 years ago, a stroke, sudden, no long goodbye, which I've never decided whether to be grateful for or not. Some days both at once. My son Marcus answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad. My check just bounced at the hardware store." A pause that lasted just slightly too long to be nothing. "Yeah. About that. Priya and I have been looking at your accounts, and we moved some things around. We didn't want to worry you with the details yet. You moved money out of my checking account without telling me." "Dad, it's not like that. We consolidated some things into a joint account so we could keep a better eye on things. It's honestly for your protection." Protection. I have flown through thunderstorms over the Rockies with less turbulence in my chest than that single word gave me standing in a hardware store parking lot. "Nobody asked me," I said. "We didn't want to make it a whole conversation," Marcus said. "We just wanted to handle it. I want to be fair to my son here, the way I'd want anyone to be fair to their own child, because I don't believe for 1 second that Marcus woke up one morning and decided to strip his father of financial control out of malice. That's not how these things happen. They happen the way turbulence happens, you don't notice the front moving in until you're already inside it. It had started roughly 7 months earlier, the way these things always seem to start, small, reasonable, dressed in the language of love. I'd had a minor health scare in the spring, nothing serious, a fainting spell from dehydration after mowing the lawn on a hot day, resolved after 20 minutes and a glass of water and confirmed by my doctor to be exactly that and nothing more. But Marcus and his wife Priya had been at the house that day, and I think that single incident became, in their minds, a data point they never fully let go of. After that, Priya started calling more often, always with the same gentle, testing questions. "Dad, are you eating enough? Dad, have you been keeping up with your pills? Dad, do you ever feel dizzy?" Reasonable questions, on their own. But questions, I would learn, are rarely asked in isolation. They accumulate into a narrative. Marcus offered to help streamline my finances, not long after, set up online access to my accounts, just so it's easier to check in. I agreed, because he's my son, and because 34 years of flying had taught me plenty about instrument panels and nothing at all about online banking, so his offer felt genuinely useful rather than concerning. Then came a joint account, in case of emergencies. Then automatic transfers I hadn't fully understood I'd authorized. Then, apparently, without a single conversation, a full consolidation of accounts that left my checking balance thin enough that a $47 check bounced in front of a line of strangers at a hardware store I'd been a loyal customer of for over 2 decades. At no point in those 7 months did anyone sit across from me and ask directly whether I felt capable of managing my own finances. If they had, I would have told them plainly. The fainting spell was dehydration, confirmed by a doctor, resolved in 20 minutes, and I had not had a single episode since. Instead, my granddaughter Ellie, 9 years old, asked me at Sunday dinner why Daddy kept checking on Grandpa's brain. I was sitting right there. Nobody thought to ask me directly what I thought about any of it. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever had people who love you quietly decide the worst about you without ever once checking whether it was true, let me know in the comments. I want to understand how many of you are living exactly this story tonight. Here is the part of my life that my son, for all his good intentions, has never fully understood, because I never once thought it was something I needed to advertise at the dinner table. During my flying career, Carol and I lived modestly. We never bought a house bigger than we needed, never leased a new car, never took the kind of vacations that make for good photographs. Instead, starting in 1989, we began quietly buying small rental properties, first a duplex near the regional airport where I'd started my career, then a few more over the following 2 decades, always paid for in cash from careful saving, never financed, never leveraged. By the time I retired, Carol and I owned 14 properties outright across 3 counties. No mortgages. No debt of any kind attached to any of them. Those properties generate roughly $22,000 a month in rental income, on top of my airline pension. My home has been paid off since Marcus was in middle school. The investment accounts Carol and I built together over 3 decades sit comfortably north of $4 million. Marcus knew we owned a few rental places. He had never once asked how many, what they earned, or what any of it was actually worth, because in 39 years of being my son, it apparently never occurred to him that the modest, unassuming father who wore the same brown work jacket to church every Sunday might be sitting on considerably more than getting by. He assumed I was a retired pilot living carefully on a pension. He wasn't entirely wrong. I do live carefully, the way you learn to when you've spent 3 decades reading fuel gauges for a living. But careful and vulnerable are not the same word, and somewhere in those 7 months, my son had quietly started treating them as if they were. I did not call Marcus back that night. I did not confront Priya. I bought a plain spiral notebook from a drugstore and I began writing things down, the way I'd been trained for 34 years to log every anomaly in a cockpit, however small. Every date. Every conversation. The exact language Marcus used when he mentioned streamlining. The date of the bounced check. Every instance where Priya asked a loaded question dressed up as casual concern. I called my attorney, a steady, unhurried woman named Diane Foster who had handled Carol's and my estate planning for nearly 20 years. I asked her to pull the paperwork on every account change made in the last 7 months. What we found wasn't outright theft. Marcus hadn't taken anything for himself, but it was built entirely on an assumption about my capacity that no doctor had ever confirmed, and that nobody had ever tested by simply asking me. I also scheduled an independent cognitive evaluation with a neurologist unconnected to my regular doctor, sitting through the full battery of questions alone, unassisted, unprompted. The results came back exactly as I expected: full clarity, sharp memory, no impairment whatsoever. A signed, notarized letter stating plainly that I was fully competent to manage every aspect of my own financial and personal affairs. I never needed that letter to know who I am. I got it because I understood, from decades of flying, that instruments exist for exactly the moment someone doubts your judgment and you need something more objective than your own word to settle the question. If you've ever had to formally document your own competence to people who claim to love you, type "logged" in the comments below. I read every single one. I wasn't carrying this alone, and I think that matters, because stories like this can start to feel like one man against an entire family, when the truth is the world usually has more decency in it than that, if you know where to look. There was Diane, my attorney, who told me plainly during our first meeting, "Frank, nobody gets to quietly decide you're incapable without asking you first, not even your own son." There was Ruth Alvarez, the branch manager at my credit union, who'd known me for 15 years and who pulled me aside one afternoon to mention, off the record, that the recent account consolidation didn't sit entirely right with her, and that she'd be documenting the timeline regardless of whose name was on the authorization. And there was Captain Eli Wozniak, my old co-pilot from nearly 2 decades of shared routes, a man who had trusted me with his life in weather that would make most people's hands shake. When I called him mostly just a vent, he listened for a long while without interrupting, then said something that has stuck with me since. "Frank, you spent 34 years being the calmest man in the cockpit during the worst storms anybody ever flew through. Don't let your own kitchen table be the first place that composure gets questioned without evidence. None of these people rescued me, and I don't believe I needed rescuing, and neither does anyone watching this who recognizes their own situation in mine tonight. What they did was simpler, and more important, they confirmed out loud that what I already knew about myself was true, and that what was happening in my own family wasn't some acceptable act of protection." It was a quiet erosion of my voice, wrapped in language that made it sound like love. Diane called me on a Tuesday morning with something that changed the entire shape of what I understood about the last 7 months. "Frank, I need you to sit down for this one." I was already sitting at the kitchen table, the notebook open in front of me. "Go ahead." I did some digging through the county filings, the way we discussed. Marcus met with an elder law attorney 6 weeks ago. Not for estate planning, for an initial consultation about the process for petitioning a limited conservatorship. I set my coffee down very carefully, because my hands had started to shake and I didn't want to give the moment the satisfaction of a broken mug. He was looking into taking control of my finances through the courts. An initial consultation, Frank. Not a filing. It's possible he never intended to go through with it. But it tells us something important: the account consolidation wasn't just casual overreach. There was a plan forming behind it, one that never once involved a conversation with you. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Not the anger you'd expect. Anger comes in fast and hot, and this wasn't that. This was colder, slower, the particular disbelief of realizing that somewhere in the last 7 months, my own son had begun quietly exploring the legal machinery to declare me unfit, without once giving me the chance to answer a single direct question about my own mind. Diane's advice mirrored, almost word for word, what I imagine any good attorney tells a client in this position, and it ran directly against every instinct I had. For now, let them believe you haven't noticed. The moment they think you've caught on, they'll get defensive, stop talking, and you'll lose the chance to understand the full picture. People reveal themselves far more honestly through ordinary behavior than they ever do once they know they're being watched. I've never been much of an actor. 34 years in a cockpit teaches you control, not concealment. Those are different skills entirely. But I understood the logic, and for the next several weeks, I played the part of a father who hadn't noticed a thing. When Marcus called to check in, I thanked him for looking out for me. When Priya mentioned, almost too casually, that they'd found a really nice place during a drive one weekend, a retirement community with a manicured entrance and a name that sounded like a resort, I told her it looked lovely. I meant it, too. It probably is lovely, for someone who chooses it. During those weeks, other moments began surfacing that I'd previously waved away without much thought. Marcus had asked, almost in passing, how many of those rental places I still owned, and when I gave a vague answer, he hadn't pushed, which told me he still fundamentally underestimated the scale of what he was asking about. I wrote that down too. I moved through my own life on 2 tracks during that stretch, the version of me my family believed they were quietly managing toward a courtroom filing, and the version of me that was assembling, with the same patience I'd once used to run a pre-flight checklist, a complete and accurate record of exactly what had happened. I didn't confront Marcus over the phone, and I didn't do it in anger. I invited him and Priya to dinner at my house, on my terms, at my table, the same table where Marcus had done his homework as a boy, where Carol had rolled out pie crust every Thanksgiving for over 3 decades. I let the evening breathe first. I asked about Ellie's school year. I let Priya tell a long, warm story about a work project she was proud of. Only after the plates were cleared did I reach beside my chair and set the notebook on the table, followed by the neurologist's letter, followed by a printed timeline documenting every account change, and finally, a single page summarizing Diane's findings about the consultation with the elder law attorney. Marcus's face changed the instant he saw that last page. Not confusion, recognition. He understood immediately what he was looking at. "Dad, we were only exploring options," he said, and there was something in his voice cracking slightly on the word exploring, as if some part of him already sensed it wasn't going to land the way he needed it to. I didn't raise my voice. I opened to the page where I'd logged the date of the bounced check, and I read it back to them in the same even tone I'd once used to read out altitude clearances. I slid the neurologist's letter across the table and watched Priya's hands go still while she read it. Then I told them, plainly, what Diane had found about the consultation. "You met with a lawyer about taking legal control of my life," I said, "and in 7 months, nobody once sat me down and asked whether I actually needed help, or what kind, or how I'd want it handled. You built an entire plan around me without me in the room." The silence that followed was the longest I'd sat through since the night Carol passed. Marcus stared at the table. Priya's eyes filled, but to her credit, she didn't look away, which I respected more than I expected to. Marcus spoke first, and to his credit, he didn't try to argue his way around it. "I panicked after the fainting spell," he said quietly. "I kept picturing you alone in that house and something going wrong and nobody finding out for days. I told myself I was being responsible. I never once let myself think about how it would feel from your side, because if I did, I think I would have had to admit I was scared, not that you were incapable. Those are two very different problems," I said, and only one of them was actually happening. Priya wiped her eyes. I kept feeding that fear instead of questioning it. Every little thing you forgot, every slow morning, I turned into evidence, because it felt safer than just asking you directly and maybe hearing an answer I couldn't control. She looked at me, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something honest in her expression instead of something managed. "We started treating you like a risk to mitigate instead of a person to talk to. I am not going to pretend that sentence undid 7 months of quiet erosion over the course of a single dinner. It didn't. But it was the first completely true thing either of them had said since the whole situation began, and true things, however uncomfortable, are where any real repair has to start." The accounts were restructured within the week. Diane and Ruth made certain of that, with proper authorization this time, every signature verified, every change explained to me before it happened rather than after. But trust doesn't move at the speed of paperwork. That took considerably longer. Marcus started coming by on Saturday mornings, not to check on me, but to help with actual projects around the house, fixing the porch railing, clearing the gutters, tasks he'd never once volunteered for in nearly 40 years as my son. He didn't make a production of it. He just showed up with tools. Priya began asking real questions instead of quietly building a file. Actual questions, the kind that require waiting for an honest answer instead of already assuming one. For months after that dinner, Marcus asked whether I'd be open to a standing family conversation twice a year, where we talk openly, together, about my health and my future, not decided quietly around me, but discussed with me, while I remain more than capable of speaking for myself. I agreed, not because I needed the meeting to protect myself, but because I understood Marcus needed it far more, to relearn that love and control were never supposed to be the same instrument. Ellie asked me last month to help her build a model airplane for a school project, with no particular awareness that I'd spent 34 years actually flying the real thing until I mentioned it almost in passing. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table, and I watched her face light up learning the same aerodynamics I'd once explained to student pilots decades earlier. Marcus stood in the doorway, quiet, watching, and for the first time in a long while, I saw him looking at me the way he used to as a boy, not as a liability requiring management, but as his father. "Here's what I want to leave you with tonight, because I think it matters more than the properties, more than the money, more than any single detail of this particular story. Respect isn't something you extend to people only after they've proven they haven't slipped. Respect is what you offer first, by asking, before you ever assume. Marcus loved me through every one of those 7 months. I never doubted that, not even at the worst of it. But love without asking quietly becomes control wearing a gentler word, and none of us, not Marcus, not Priya, not me, noticed exactly when that shift happened, because it never announces itself. It simply arrives disguised as protection. If there's someone in your life you've quietly started deciding things for, a parent, a grandparent, an older relative, do one simple thing before anything else. Ask them directly. Then actually listen to what they say back. And if you're the one being underestimated tonight, the one whose competence someone else decided to question without ever once checking with you first, I want you to know your dignity was never up for a vote you weren't invited to. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, drop a comment telling me which part hit you hardest, and subscribe for the next one, because there's always another family, another quiet assumption mistaken for love, another patient person somewhere gathering their own notebook, waiting for the moment the truth finally gets to speak for itself. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.